Making up most of the Arabian Peninsula lies the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, a land where most of the surface is uninhabitable and barren. Yet the land underneath the surface holds the treasure that fuels the global economy. This nation is the energy powerhouse that feeds the machines of the modern world, yet its political system is oftentimes set in the Middle Ages. It holds state-of-the-art infrastructure and a standard of living that is the enemy of many around the world. Yet its social system is in many ways the product of a past of which most of the world has left behind. Before I delve further, I want to point out that Saudi Arabia is a very controversial country that elicits a lot of strong opinions, and for that reason I'm going to try to be as objective as possible. Anyway, located in the Middle East, taking up much of the Arabian Peninsula, is, of course, Saudi Arabia, a nation that borders two bodies of water, the Red Sea to the west, home to some of the richest coral reefs in the world, and the Persian Gulf to the east, home to much of the country's energy reserves. Both act as passages for sea cargo that cross through the choke points that Saudis don't directly control, making the country vulnerable. The first is the Strait of Hormuz, in between Saudi Arabia's enemy, Iran, and an exclave of the friendly neutral country of Oman, which is attached to the ally of the UAE. A large chunk of oil and gas exports travel through this contentious strait, connecting the Persian Gulf to the Gulf of Oman and then the Indian Ocean. The other strait connects to the Red Sea, or I should say connects the Red Sea to the Gulf of Aden, which eventually flows into the Indian Ocean. And this is also fairly contentious given the influence of rival Shiite groups consolidating power in neighboring Yemen, as well as Somali pirates off the coast. You can see why the Saudis are sometimes paranoid. Now, those are the waters, but what about the land? Well, less than 10% of the land is actually suitable for agriculture. The most notable area displaying this is the Empty Quarter, a vast and beautiful land of sand dunes as far as the eye can see, but it's not particularly useful for human habitation or anything productive outside of tourism. These deserts, however, do act as a buffer between other states, such as the contentious Yemen, the neutral Oman, and the allied UAE, as well as the frenemy Qatar. For this reason, most of the population resides on the coast or near the coasts, which generally speaking have more varied elevation and more greenery. Cities like Riyadh, the capital, are the exception as it's more inland. On the other hand, the most famous cities in Saudi Arabia, like Mecca and Medina, are close to the Red Sea. The capital, nonetheless, Riyadh, is again located more inland, making up the largest city situated roughly in the center of the country on a plateau. Unlike Mecca and Medina, its history is a lot more recent. The city also acts as the headquarters of various corporations and banks, and in many ways is the nation's gateway to the world. Towards the northeast lies the border with Iraq, a close proximity to the enemy Iran. This region is also where much of the oil and gas is concentrated. This region also has a large Shia Muslim population, similar to Iraq and Iran, in contrast to most of Saudi Arabia, which is run by Sunnis. As you can tell, this has led to quite a lot of contention. Towards the northern border, not only lies Iraq but also Jordan, along with the ally Kuwait. There is also the island nation off the Gulf Coast called Bahrain, with a Shia majority population but a Sunni Saudi-backed government. Speaking of the government, let's do a brief overview of the nation's history. Little is known about pre-Islamic Arabia, in sharp contrast to other Arabized states like Iraq, Egypt, and Syria, which have civilizations that far predate the Arabs and Islam. The Arabs of what is now Saudi Arabia don't really have that much of a historical record that we can rely on. It's not to say they didn't have any history before 600 AD, but oftentimes the Muslims declared the age before Islam to be the age of ignorance, and destroyed a great deal of what we know about it. Mecca and Medina are to this day the most important cities in Islam. Muhammad was a merchant turned military commander who conquered what is now part of western Saudi Arabia. This was followed by the Rashiduns, who expanded the caliphate. However, by the time Uthman was running the show, Islam had spread throughout much of the Arabian Peninsula, Egypt, and Persia, crushing both Persian and Greek armies alike, through the use of camel and horse cavalry together. However, controversy over the death of the last Rashidun, Ali, led to a rupture between Sunni and Shiite Muslims, for reasons that are way too complicated for me to explain in this video. Nonetheless, the conflict exists to this day. The Rashiduns would eventually be taken over by the Umayyad Caliphate, who rapidly spread their territory and Islam even further, spreading all the way from India to Spain. They were eventually replaced by the Abbasids, who moved their capital to Baghdad in what is now Iraq, and sparked the Islamic Golden Age. However, by this time, the deserts of what are now Saudi Arabia were outshined by the activity in Baghdad, Egypt, and Persia, which had become centers of science and culture. These deserts once again moved back into obscurity, as various tribes clashed around the arid landscapes, fighting over what few resources there were. The Ottoman Turks, the last Muslim empire, would eventually take over the Red Sea coast of what is now Saudi Arabia. However, by the 1700s, the Saudi dynasty consolidated power through the tribal leader Muhammad bin Saud near Riyadh. He would forge an alliance with the founder of the Wahhabi movement, a fundamentalist branch of Sunni Muslims. Under this pact, the Saudis ran the political sphere while the Wahhabis ran the religious sphere. At the time, this didn't mean much, as the Ottomans were still the head honchos of the Middle East, and various proto-Saudi states were too weak to exert themselves, oftentimes creating new states and then collapsing on and off. This is what was changed during World War I, when under the guidance of T.E. Lawrence, the British promised to help the Arabs seek independence from the Ottoman Turks, who were allies of Britain's enemy Germany. While the Arabs were successful, the British and French turned their backs on them, promoting much of their own colonialism in the region, converting the Middle East to their control, with barriers and borders with little regard to tribal, linguistic, or religious identity, or even natural borders for that matter. However, they did give some limited territory to the Saudis. Through some small-scale battles, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia was formed in 1932. And by World War II, vast oil reserves were found in the impoverished country. Speaking of World War II, on a boat trip to the Suez Canal, US President Franklin Delano Roosevelt met with King Saud and made an agreement that the US would offer Saudi Arabia protection in return for providing oil, an agreement that exists to this day. The two men got along individually. However, the pact was quite unusual, as this was a quasi-alliance between a pluralistic liberal secular open democracy and a fundamentalist authoritarian tribal monarchy. Two systems of government that hardly mesh well together. King Saud's oil extraction caused mass wealth, but like a young athlete who makes a few millions, he was really bad at money, acquiring a large amount of debt, and was eventually forced to abdicate and replaced by his half-brother Prince Faisal, who promoted pan-Islamism and was a champion of the Palestinian cause, issuing an oil embargo on the West, including the United States. Due to their support of Israel, the US nonetheless continued to keep Saudi Arabia relatively close due to Faisal's fierce anti-communism, which he saw as atheistic and against Islam. The country continued to strengthen its administration and spread Wahhabist Islam, and use oil wealth to create a very strong social safety net with little taxation. Saudi Arabians get universal healthcare and a fairly good education with very little to contribute to. In a way, the government has made a pact with its people. You can enjoy a strong social safety net and a high quality of living in exchange for a lack of democracy, civil rights, and civil liberties. The country had also founded anti-communist Islamist groups in Afghanistan to fight the Soviet Union. One of them that you might have heard of was the Mujahideen, and this was partially backed by one Saudi man by the name of bin Laden, who would lead his group Al-Qaeda. However, Saudi still stayed close to the West. In 1990, it provided one of the largest forces to help the Americans and their allies kick Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait. This had led to bin Laden being outraged. And with the threat of communism gone, many Islamists saw the secular West as enemy number one. This eventually accumulated into the 9/11 attacks. 14 out of the 19 hijackers were from Saudi Arabia. Eventually, Saudi Arabia was hit by Al-Qaeda attacks themselves, along Riyadh's compounds. Eventually, Saudi Arabia would also get involved in the Yemen civil war that broke out between the Sunni side and the Shiite factions. The Shia factions did receive some limited support from Iran, and as a result, Saudi Arabia frequently bombed those Shiite areas. In 2017, the current king, Salman, also known as Mohammed bin Salman, the crown prince, engage in quite a lot of groundbreaking stances. After all, in Saudi Arabia, the throne often has. This is part of the reason why the country has been so conservative. When you pass the baton from a 90-year-old guy to an 88-year-old guy, change is going to be slow. However, Mohammed bin Salman taking control showed a generational shift in the country. And as a result, being a younger guy in his 40s, he has pursued some more modernist policies. Sometimes change requires young blood. And Mohammed bin Salman, as controversial as he is, has started up Saudi Vision 2030, which seeks to diversify his economy rather than remain dependent on oil. Mohammed bin Salman has also opened up the country to some extent, weakening the authority of the religious police, allowing women the right to drive and start their own businesses, as well as opening up movie theaters and concerts that were banned before. However, he has also kept authoritarian rule, continued to restrict freedom of speech, and has been involved in the killing of high-profile journalist Jamal Khashoggi. He has also not been particularly peaceful when it comes to Yemen and other covert operations. In other words, he has opened up the country to foreign influence in areas that don't threaten the core power structure of his family. Much of the legal system of the nation is still run by Sharia law, with very strict interpretations, frequent executions, poor human rights records for women, religious minorities, and most of all LGBT people. And all of these issues have placed strains on Saudi Arabia's alliance with the West. And oftentimes the West keeps Saudi Arabia at an arm's length. At the end of the day, this alliance is really based off of one, energy interest, and two, a mutual hostility against Iran. At this point, it's uncertain if Saudi Arabia will be able to diversify its economy outside of oil and gas, which currently make up 3/4 of its revenue. Much of the Saudi 2030 vision is based off of mega projects that tend to be more about glamour than substance. However, it's only a matter of time when we'll really know for sure. Saudi Arabia, nonetheless, is one of the 20 largest economies in the world, the largest in the Middle East, and the de facto leader of Sunni Muslimhood. Its close allies in the region are the UAE, Kuwait, and Bahrain, as well as Egypt and Jordan. It has a complex relationship with Qatar, which is both a friend and a foe. Qatar helped Saudi Arabia during the brutal bombing campaigns of Yemen, but the two are oftentimes at loggerheads. Qatar runs the Al Jazeera channel, which is the most influential Arabic news channel in the world and oftentimes covers Saudi Arabia in a less than positive light. The Saudis and their allies embargoed Qatar for a few years, but they restored relations under U.S. diplomacy in 2021, as the U.S. is both a close ally of Saudi Arabia and Qatar. Saudi Arabia has also mended relations with Israel under the table. The two still don't have diplomatic relations, but cooperate in order to thwart influences of Iran and Syria, as well as Shiite militant groups like Hezbollah and the Houthis. Saudi Arabia still maintains a close relationship with the West, but has come under scrutiny by many Westerners for its human rights record, as a nation that seems modern through its display of wealth, but isn't when it comes to its social beliefs. But also keep in mind that Saudi Arabia partially has fairly good relations with Russia and China, as they're both authoritarian states. At the end of the day, Saudi Arabia is a very powerful state, and this would have been unthinkable a century ago, when most people were just transporting themselves via camels. However, now this gas station has become a very powerful player on the world stage. The main goal of Saudi Arabia today would be to play its cards right. It must diversify its economy, mend relations with its neighbors, and balance reforms with, say, stability. When the Soviet Union made reforms, those cracks led to an opening that led to the entire communist system falling apart. For all we know, perhaps the opening of movie theaters and the allowance of women to drive will create the first fissures that could topple this quasi-theocratic state. Or maybe those reforms will help it cruise through the rest of the century. Only the sands of time will tell.